The sun had not yet touched the horizon when Elias opened his eyes, but the weight of the day was already pressing down on his chest. In the grey, pre-dawn light, his bedroom felt like a hollow shell of sanctuary. He lay still, listening to the breathing of his children in the next room, a sound that usually brought him peace, but now sharpened his anxiety. Every breath they took was a reminder of what was at stake, the life he had promised them, and the betrayal that threatened to tear it all away. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from constant tension. He felt as though he were walking through deep water, every movement requiring effort against the invisible current of fear. He walked into the cold kitchen, the floorboards creaking under a weight far heavier than his body. The air was cold, smelling of coffee. There on the table where they usually shared morning cereal sat stacked envelopes. They were cold, official, and merciless. Legal notices with bold headers stared back at him, the black ink darker than the shadows in the room. His former business partner, a man he had once called a brother, had turned every shared dream into a weapon. Elias felt the stinging bile of failure in his throat. He was a provider who could no longer provide, a father whose household was under siege. He looked at his hands, the hands that built a business from nothing, and saw them trembling like dry leaves in a gale. He needed air. He stepped out the back door into his garden, where cold, biting dew clung to the grass like fallen tears. The air was crisp, tasting of damp earth and an unfolding morning he wasn't sure he could survive. As the very first amber streaks bled into the indigo sky, Elias sank to his knees. The dampness seeped through his clothes, but he barely felt it. He didn't start with a formal prayer. He lacked the strength for eloquence. Instead, it was a raw, whispered plea, a desperate call for a sign that he wasn't abandoned. He looked up at the vast expanse of heavens and felt frighteningly small against the machinery of the legal system and the cruelty of a vengeful man. He realized that pride had been his silent, dark, treacherous architect. He had tried to carry the world on his shoulders, believing his own intellect was the only pillar holding up his life. He had ignored the whispers of intuition and the warnings of those who loved him, driven by a need to prove his worth through success. Standing on the precipice of ruin, he was forced to acknowledge the truth. He could not face this day entirely alone. The realization was a deeply painful breaking, a cracking of the broken ego that left him exposed, but finally his spirit opened to something greater than himself. "Protect us," he murmured, closing his eyes tight. He began to visualize a shield of radiant light that no shadow could penetrate. He prayed for a hedge of protection around his children's dreams and a fortress around his own mind, a battlefield of intrusive thoughts. He asked for a barrier between his family and the malice of the man who conspired against them. It was a request for spiritual intervention, a demand for a peace that surpassed all logic. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. As a sense of stillness settled over him, the vibration of his phone on the stone bench shattered the silence. The screen illuminated the dim garden with an artificial glow. It was a message from his former partner, an ultimatum filled with threats and the promise of ruin. The resolve Elias had just begun to nurture wavered. The battle had not even begun, and the enemy was already knocking at the gates of his soul, testing the strength of a faith he was just beginning to rediscover. Elias stared at the glowing screen, the words of the message searing into his vision like cold fire. It was more than a threat. It was a mockery of his life's work, sent by the very same person he had once trusted. In that instant, the fragile peace he had sought in the dew-damp garden evaporated, replaced by a scalding surge of adrenaline and a bitter taste of betrayal. His fingers hovered over the screen, itching to strike back with the same venom that had been spat at him. The storm within him roared, a tempest of vengeance demanding an eye for an eye. His heart hammered against his ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of war that drowned out the soft morning birdsong. He felt the heavy, dark pull of his old self, believing that strength was found in the sharpness of a ruthless response. But as he looked up at the sky, where the indigo was softening into a pale lilac, he took a ragged breath. The cold air stung his lungs, grounding his racing thoughts. He realized that responding in kind would only shackle him further to the darkness his adversary had created. He lowered the phone, placing it face down on the cold stone bench, to extinguish the artificial light. The prayer shifted. It was no longer a frantic plea to be saved from the fire. It became a request for something far more difficult to achieve, the wisdom of guidance. "Guide my steps," he whispered, his voice cracking, not toward retaliation, but toward the truth. He sought the strength to be still, while the world around him screamed for aggressive action. It was a surrender of his ego in exchange for a higher perspective, a conscious choice to seek a path that honor could walk upon. In the heavy silence, a memory flickered to life. He saw his grandfather, a man of quiet, unshakable faith who had faced his own seasons of crushing debt and failed harvests. He remembered the old man's calloused hands, folded by a worn wooden chair every morning before the sun rose. His grandfather hadn't prayed for bags of gold or the ruin of his enemies, but for the character to handle the day with dignity. He remembered him saying that faith wasn't a shield against the storm, but a light to see the path through it. That ancestral resilience began to flow through Elias's veins, a quiet, steady inheritance of spirit that no court order or lawyer could ever seize. He began a rhythmic, internal cadence, a prayer that felt like clearing a dense forest. "Remove the thorns of bitterness from my heart," he murmured softly. "Clear the path of the shadows cast by deceit. Let the toxic influences that bind me to this anger be cut away like dead wood." He visualized the path ahead of him being systematically cleared of obstacles, leaving only a straight, clean line to follow. Every word he breathed out seemed to push back the oppressive fog of his anxiety. He wasn't just praying for his bank account anymore. He was praying for the preservation of his own light. His gaze drifted back toward the house, where his children remained undisturbed in their dreams. He realized then that the protection he sought was for their innocence and the security of a future not defined by his own fears. If he let the poison of this betrayal seep into his soul, it would eventually stain the sanctuary he had built for them. The stakes were no longer about numbers on a spreadsheet. They were about the legacy of peace he would leave behind. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the garden in vibrant shades of gold, a sharp memory pierced through his thoughts. It was a divine coincidence, a fragment of a conversation from years ago during the initial signing of the partnership. He remembered a specific, obscure clause tucked away in the margins of the original contract, a provision regarding ethical dissolution that his partner had surely overlooked. Elias rose from the stone bench, his joints stiff from the morning chill, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in months. The golden light of the full sunrise spilled across the garden, turning the dew on the grass into a field of diamonds. He realized that the contract clause he had remembered was the physical manifestation of the guidance he had sought in the dark. As he walked toward the house, he knew the paper was only half the battle. He felt the damp earth beneath his feet, a grounding reminder of the reality he was finally ready to face with open hands. He paused at the threshold, closing his eyes to offer a final petition. This wasn't a plea for survival, but a prayer of gratitude and redemption. He whispered a release of his own guilt, forgiving the man he had been, the one whose ego had blinded him to the coming storm. In that moment, the heavy chains of anxiety fell away, replaced by the quiet strength he had seen in his grandfather's eyes years ago. He dressed for the day with deliberate focus. The legal notices on the kitchen table no longer looked like death warrants. They were puzzles waiting to be solved. He kissed his children as they stirred, seeing in their smiles the reason for his resilience. The protection he had prayed for settled over him like an invisible cloak, a hedge of peace that kept panic at bay. This was the spiritual armor he had sought, forged not of steel, but of a quiet, unshakable faith that transformed his fear into a focused, calm resolve. When he stepped into the office of his former partner, the air was thick with the electricity of an impending ambush. His adversary sat behind a mahogany desk, flanked by lawyers, his face a mask of practiced triumph. "I expected a phone call from your attorney, not a personal visit," the former partner sneered. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't feel the heat of anger rising. Instead, he felt a strange, detached compassion for the man, a prisoner of his own greed. Elias sat down with the steady grace of someone who knew a secret the world couldn't touch. He spoke with a voice that was low and unshakable, presenting the forgotten clause with a calm that unnerved the room. He wasn't fighting for his pride anymore. He was standing for the truth. As the lawyers reviewed the document, the former partner's smirk withered. The divine coincidence was a surgical strike against the conspiracy, but Elias's demeanor truly disarmed them. He wasn't there to burn bridges or demand a pound of flesh. He was there to demand what was fair. The tension remained high. Yet Elias felt he was standing in a storm where the wind could not reach him. The hedge of protection was real. It allowed him to negotiate from power rather than desperation. By noon, the threats turned into a hushed negotiation, leading to a truly fair settlement that secured his family's future and dismantled the traps laid against him. Walking out, Elias didn't feel worldly pride. He felt transformation. He returned home as the afternoon light softened, realizing his identity was no longer tethered to his bank account. He breathed in the scent of blooming jasmine, a sweetness he hadn't noticed during his weeks of worry. He had been stripped to his core and rebuilt by the silence of the morning. The prayer hadn't just changed his circumstances, it had changed his soul. He looked at his garden, now bathed in light, and understood that the protection he found wasn't a one-time shield. It was a new way of living. The sun was now fully up, and as he watched his children play, Elias realized the morning prayer was not the end, but the start of a life under constant protection. He watched the children run through the tall grass, their laughter a symphony of the very peace he had fought to preserve.